Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to class 2 of the Waraqat, our class on the Waraqat of Imam al-Juwayni, rahimahullah. We went through the bios of the author, and also we mentioned that this is the sharḥ of al-Mahalli, who's a very famous Shafi'i scholar, Jalaluddin al-Mahalli, of the Jalalain fame. And on top of that, Imam al-Hattab, who was one of the Maliki scholars, as I mentioned last time, took that sharḥ, which is the most famous sharḥ of the Waraqat, and expanded it and opened it up to the Malikiyah, the people of the Malikiyah, so it could fit in with the way we view usul. So that's what he did in this job. But as I said, most of the things in this are to do with terminology, understanding what the terms mean in this science. So last time we talked about usul al-fiqh and the meaning of that term in a linguistic sense. Today we're going to go into the aqsam al-hukm al-shar'i. And for those who are with us with the Ibn Ashir classes, he also mentioned these particular ahkam. And there's basically three different types of hukum, three different types of arriving at a judgment or arriving at knowledge in the Arabic language. So that's where we're going to start from, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على خير المرسلين وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم سبحانك اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. So this area that we're doing in this book primarily deals with what's called the hukm shar' or the hukm al-shar'i, al-hukm al-shar'i or hukm al-shar'. The shar' meaning the divine law, principally the Quran, but on top of that, the sunnah of the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the ijma' of the ummah and various other things, which are primarily what's called the usul al-fiqh, the primary bases upon which fiqh is based. But this is only one of the three branches of the ways that human beings acquire knowledge, the way we come to know things. One is through the divine knowledge. We see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us and we accept it is true, and we know that is the way it is. He goes into an explanation of what's meant by knowledge, by the way, in this particular class that we're going to. The other one that we did was the previous book that we studied, which was the Jawhara al-Tawheed of Imam al-Laqani, and that dealt with what's called hukm al-aql, or al-hukm al-aqli, which is knowledge that you arrive at through the exercise of your aql. So it's not something that you are told by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For example, knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists in order for us to accept that there is a shara is part of the hukm al-aqli, knowing Allah and knowing his sifat. So and also the laws of mathematics, for example, 1 + 1 = 2 and things of that nature. That's purely in the realm of the aql and not in the realm of something that you're told by the shar'. And then there's a third type of knowledge, which is called al-hukm al-adi, which is the knowledge that you arrive at through the exercise of your senses and seeing patterns in the world around you. Basically what they know as science in modern times. So seeing a pattern repeat itself, then you know that thing is likely to happen in the same way. Every time you put your hand into a fire and you get a burn, and then it happens the second time, and so you realize then by that pattern that fire burns you. Or when you drink water and your thirst is quenched, you realize that water has an effect of quenching your thirst. So you have that knowledge by trial and error, by experimentation, by seeing with your senses. That's got nothing to do with the shara. You don't have to have a law from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or an ayat from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling you this particular thing. And that's got nothing to do with the aql. It's not something that you arrive at through exercise of your heart or your mind or your capacity to reason things out. But this subject matter now is primarily completely to do with the shara and how we arrive at fiqh, which we mentioned last time, which is literally understanding. But in this particular concept is the understanding of the rulings of the things that we have to do by means of exercising ijtihad. So that's fiqh. We mentioned last time that fiqh is not the things that you know automatically because that you don't have to exercise your mind. Like there's 5 prayers. There's no reasoning needed to work out those five prayers because it's clearly told to us. There's no difference of opinion. All of the scholars agree there's 5 prayers. All of the scholars agree we fast Ramadan. These are things that are known min al-daruri min al-din. They're automatic. And we're going to come to this term daruri today, inshallah. So he goes, well, we've been going through this book word by word of the sharḥ of al-Hattab. So today we come to aqsam al-hukm al-shar'i, the types or the divisions of legalistic ruling. The judgments based upon law, the way, the ruling that you attach to certain actions. So he says here, ثم بين الأحكام المرادة في قوله الأحكام الشرعية. Then he makes clear the ahkam, the rulings, the judgments, the propositions, the way you arrive at things, al-murada, that are wanted, that he wants, when he says, or that he's referring to, when he says في قوله al-ahkam al-shar'iyya. When he says this word ahkam al-shar'iyya, legal rulings, what is he referring to? Now he explains. He says, فقال الأحكام الشرعية, ahkam, these rulings are 7 in nature. So these are the rulings that you attach to particular actions to determine the level of command in them to you, or the level of prohibition in them to you, in terms of whether you have to do them, or in terms of whether you have to leave them, and so on. So this is what he means by hukum here. So he says here there's 7. Al-wajib, obligatory. Mandub, recommended or encouraged. Mubah, permissible. Mahdhur, which is this word that means the same thing as haram, forbidden. Makruh, which means disencouraged or disliked. And these next 2, which are not exactly the same types of ruling, but they are similar because they apply to the preconditions that have to be in place often for these actions. And he says sahih, which is valid, and batil, which is invalid. Or sahih, which means sound, and batil, which means unsound, to use a different English term. So he says, فَالْفِقْهِ, this science we refer to as fiqh, is al-ilmu bihadihi sab'a, is the knowledge of these 7 things. So if you know what these things are, that is fiqh, that is understanding what to do. When you come to wudu, you know what's obligatory for you in wudu, and you know what's forbidden for you in wudu, you know what's recommended, you know what's sunnah, which is a part of the recommendation bracket. Then you know how to do wudu. You have fiqh in that regard. So it is the knowledge of these 7 things. A ma'rifatu juz'iyatiha. In other words, knowing the things to which these things connect. The juz'iyat are literally the particulates, in a sense. So each hukum, when it attaches to something, that's a part of the things that have that ruling of being that thing. So the obligatory actions, the wajibat, the mandubat, the recommended actions, the mubahat, the things that are permissible for us to do, eat. Well, I mean, sometimes these things can be obligatory when you're starving to eat, but on the whole, eating and drinking and sleeping are permissible acts. Mahdhurat, things that are forbidden, acts which are forbidden. Makruhat, things which are disliked. And af'al sahihah, sound actions. Wal af'alul batila, and unsound actions. And then he goes into some examples. كالعلم بأن هذا الفعل مثلا واجب, like the knowledge, for example, that this particular action, for example, is wajib, is obligatory. وهذا mandub, and that one is recommended. وهذا mubah, and that one is permissible. وهذا mahdhur, and that one is forbidden. Like, let's say, for example, drinking alcohol. وهذا makruh, and that is disliked. Or وهذا صحيح, that is a sound action. In other words, by sound here, it means that it's acceptable in the eyes of Allah. I'll give you an example of an unsound action would be praying without wudu. You might meet all of the conditions, all of the obligations of prayer, but because you haven't got wudu, your prayer is unsound. So this is referring to whether it's acceptable in the eyes of Allah, sound and unsound. وَهَذَا بَاطِل, and that's unsound. وَلَيْسَ الْمُرَادُ الْعِلْمُ بِتَعْرِيفَاتِهِ هَذِهِ الْحُكْمِ. So the knowledge here, when he says that we have to know the ahkam here, he's not simply referring to knowing these rulings on their own, but knowing the things to which these rulings apply. That is fiqh. You can't simply know that there are different categories and that's it. I know fiqh. I know there are things called wajib. I know there are things called... No, it's to know the actions that these things... When you take an action, which bracket that action falls in. That's fiqh. When you have all of the tools, then you have the capacity to take any action and find out whether that action falls in the bracket of something which is obligatory or forbidden. Everything that we do in this world will fall into one of these categories. There's nothing that we do that will not fall into one of these categories. So he says here, وَلَيْسَ الْمُرَادُ الْعِلْمُ بِتَعْرِفَاتِ. It's not simply what is intended here, that you have knowledge of the definitions themselves. بتعريفات هذه الأحكام المذكورة, of these mentioned rulings. فإن ذلك من علم أصول الفقه لا من علم الفقه. So because simply knowing the definitions of these rulings is part of the science of usul al-fiqh, which is the science we are going to be studying. But in this particular area, he's talking about what fiqh is. And so he says it's not part of the science of fiqh. You're not a faqih if you simply know the fact that how to define wajib. You're a faqih if you know that wudu is fard and so on and so forth. So that's the differential here. وإطلاق الأحكام على هذه الأمور فيه تجوز. So when he uses the term ahkam to refer to these particular matters, the actual obligatory things themselves, it's not a hukum, because the hukum is the thing by which you judge that action. But he's referring to the actions themselves, for example, the prayer, as being a hukum. So he says here there's tajawuz in this. It's, he's stretching the limits of the definition here. He's sort of making allowances. He's referring to something by what applies to it rather than by its thing itself. So tajawuz means permissibility. He's stretching the limits of in terms of his definition here by using the word ahkam. So itlaq means to refer to something. Atlaqa, you might call somebody the name. You atlaqan alama ala shakhsin. Atlaq al-sarah is when you free somebody. But it's applying something to something. وإطلاق الأحكام على هذه الأمور, by saying the word hukum applies to these things that we've just mentioned, these matters, there is some level of tajawuz, of permissibility in the language. لأنها متعلق الأحكام, because these things are connected to the ahkam. They are the things to which the ahkam connect. They are not the ahkam themselves. والأحكام الشرعية خمسة. The ahkam al-shar'iyya. So he's not just referring to these things, he's also referring to mandub and wajib and things like this here. So these terms here also are not the hukum. The hukum is the verb in them. So the hukum here is permissibility, is obligation, is recommendation, is forbiddenness, that the actual action. Whereas saying something is wajib refers to the actual things that are wajib, which is not the hukum. The hukum that we are saying is we are declaring something, we are putting the obligation on that thing. That's the hukum. That's what we're doing with when we're making that decision. We are taking this concept of being obligatory and we are applying it to that thing. So he's saying calling even wajib a hukum is a little bit stretching the language, because that is the active participle rather than the actual ruling itself. I mean, that would apply even more to the actions, like I said, like prayer, but even to these terms themselves, there is some permissibility in calling it a hukum. linguistically. Although in when we speak in day-to-day conversation, we would always say that. We say something's obligatory, and that's the hukm. Whereas the hukm is actually applying obligation onto that thing. So he's making some differentiation, saying, look, I know we're being a little bit loose with the language, but it's understandable. So he says here, in fact, the ahkam al-shar'iyya khamsatun, and they are al-ijab, obligating, nadb, recommending, ibaha, permitting, karaha, disliking, and tahrim, forbidding. They are in fact the ahkam. وَجَعْلُهُ الْأَحْكَامَ سَبْعَةً إِسْتِلَاحُ النَّاسِ. So when he makes these ahkam 7, that is his own technical usage of it. But most people don't comply with this. They don't think it's 7. Most people, in fact, say it's 5. But he himself has included 2 other things within it. وَالَّذِي عَلَيْهِ الْجُمْهُورِ. The majority, however, take the position أَنَّ الْأَحْكَامَ خَمْسَةٌ لَا سَبْعَةٌ, that the rulings are 5, not 7. So sahih and batil are not considered to be the ahkam shar'iyya. They're part of ahkam wad'iyya, but that's a separate conversation, because those are things that have to be in place before you can do an action. Very often, like a precondition or a sabab. For example, dhuhr is not obligatory if the sun never reaches the zenith. It's the sabab of the sun coming into that particular place that makes it. Those are the ahkam al-wad'iyya, where these 2 things come into play. But anyway, we'll move on as he's putting it. So he says, أن الأحكام خمسة لا سبعة كما ذكرناها, that the rulings are 5, not 7, as we have mentioned them here. لأن الصحيح, because when something is sound, it is imma wajib aw ghayri. So when something is sound, that action could be obligatory, could be recommended. You could have a witr prayer being unsound. Witr is not obligatory amongst us. You could have your 2 rakats nafila after dhuhr, and you could lose your wudu and pray them without wudu without realizing it, and they would be unsound. Your dhuhr itself could be unsound or sound. So they apply to all of these categories, sound and unsound. Something can be wajib, something can be even forbidden, something can be disliked, and so on and so forth, and they can be sound or they can be unsound. وَالْبَاطِلْ دَاخِلٌ فِي الْمَحْظُورِ. And he says here, in fact, when it comes to the unsound, in one sense, any forbidden action is unsound in one sense. So he says it's included within what is mahdhur. And I mean, we could say, for example, like praying without wudu is mahdhur, is forbidden. Deliberately praying in a direction other than the qibla is mahdhur, it's forbidden. So it's talking about an aspect that lies within forbiddenness when you say batil, when you say something is unsound. وَجَعَلُوا بَعْضِهِمْ الْأَحْكَامَ تِسْعَةٌ. So وَجَعَلَ بَعْضُهُمْ الْأَحْكَامَ, and some of them made the ahkam tis'a, made these rulings 9 in number, so they added. وَزَادَ الرُّخْصَ وَالْعَظِيمَ. And they added 2 other categories, الرُّخْصَ, which is a dispensation, which is when you do something in a way that is different to the normative ruling of that thing. For example, the normative ruling of praying, dhuhr and asr, is how many? 4 rakats. When you travel beyond the distance where you shorten the prayers, what happens? You pray 2 rakats. But that's not the norm. That's what's called a rukhsa, a special dispensation. The norm in wudu is to wash your feet. When you put on a khuf, you don't have to wash your feet anymore when you're doing wudu, so long as you're in wudu when you start, obviously. You now wipe over your feet. So that's a rukhsa. It's a dispensation. It goes against the normative ruling. And then azima is the opposite. It's when it follows the normative ruling. When something is following the normative ruling, that is the ruling that it's typically meant to follow. So they add these 2 other categories. وَهُمَا رَاجِعَانِ إِلَى الْأَحْكَامِ الْخَمْسَةِ أَيْضًا. And these things also are fall within the 5 categories. Because as I mentioned, dhuhr is an obligatory action and it can have a rukhsah attached to it. And there are other sometimes recommended actions where you can have rukhsahs attached to it, and so on and so forth. So it's, it doesn't necessarily have to be just to a fard. I mean, for example, when you're traveling, you can do non-obligatory prayers on your horseback. Sometimes not even facing the qibla. You have a special dispensation to pray them in a way that you would not normally be allowed to pray them, because normally, obviously, the qibla is an obligation on every prayer. Wallahu alam, and Allah knows best. So he goes through them one by one. تعريف الواجب. ثم شرع في تعريف الأحكام التي ذكرها بذكر لازم كل واحد منها. Then he starts to give definitions of the ahkam, of the rulings that he's mentioned here. بذكر لازم كل واحد منها, by mentioning what is an integral element of each of them, something that is integral to them, something that is entailed by them. Something, when you do these things, this necessarily follows. So here he starts with wajib. فالواجب ما يثاب على فعله ويعاقب على تركه. So the definition of something which is obligatory is something that when you do it, you are rewarded. And when you leave it, you don't do it, you are punished. That's the definition of wajib. When you do it, you receive reward. In fact, when you do an obligatory act, you receive more reward than any other type of act you can do. Even though it's obligatory on you, you're still heavily rewarded for it, because those are the things that are most loved by Allah. Then, as the famous hadith goes, then you add on the nawafil and get closer to Allah. But you start with the thing which is most beloved by Him, which is the obligatory acts. So you're rewarded for them, even though you have to do them. Still, you're rewarded for them. But if you don't do them, you are punished. The punishment entails the leaving. You get a bad action for leaving something that if you don't do your dhuhr, leave it, you've incurred a wrong action. فالواجب من حيث وصفه بالوجوب. So something which is wajib in this, by the sense that it has the quality of wujub being good. هو, this act, is ما يثاب على فعله ويعاقب على تركه. This act is the one that you rewarded for doing and punished for not doing. فالثواب على الفعل والعقاب على الترك أمر لازم للواجب. So being rewarded for doing it and being punished for not doing it is something which is an integral part, which necessarily follows, which is necessarily connected to the wajib act, the act which is wajib. من حيث وصفه بالوجوب, by means of which we mean that which has been given the hukum of being obligated. So he keeps on saying this because, as he mentioned before, there's a differentiation between wajib and wujub. And if we're talking about hukum, we're really talking about wujub. So he keeps on repeating that. He does this with every single one of them, just so he can be clear. وَلَيْسَ هُوَ حَقِيقَةُ الْوَاجِبِ. This definition, that is something you're rewarded for doing and something you're punished for not doing it, is not the reality, the essence of wajib. That would be simply something you have to do, or something that's, but this is something which necessarily follows from it. فَإِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ مَثَلًا, so he says, take the prayer, for example. فَإِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ أَمْرٌ مَعْقُولٌ مُتَسَوِّرٌ فِي نَفْسِهِ. So the prayer is something which is you can comprehend and you can conceptualize on its own without actually doing it. You can actually form an image of what the prayer is in your head. Yeah. So if I told you, think about what dhuhr is, you'll say, all right, in your head, you'll form an idea of it being 4 rakats and silent and all these sorts of things. So it's something that you can conceptualize in the head. That's the prayer. But this prayer that you conceptualize in your head is not one that you are currently being rewarded for doing, conceptualizing it, or punished for not conceptualizing it or not forming it in your head. So it has an existence, internal existence, but it's not being rewarded or punished in this particular thing. So it's when you do the act, not simply because the act is obligatory, automatically your conception of something rewards you for it. So he says here, وَهُوَ غَيْرُ حُصُولُ الثَّوَابِ بِفِعْلِهَا وَالْعِقَابُ بِتَرْكِهَا. So that prayer you've formed in your head is not the one where you are getting reward for doing it and punishment for leaving it. فَالتَّعْرِيفُ الْمَذْكُورُ لَيْسَ تَعْرِيفًا بِحَقِيقَةِ الْوَاجِبِ. So the ta'rif that we've mentioned here, the definition we've given here, is not a definition of the reality of wajib, of the obligatory thing. إذ لا يمكن تعريفة حقيقته لكثرة أصناف الواجبات, because it's not actually possible to define the reality of the wajib because there's so many different types of wajib acts. So if you're going to define it, you have to mention every single act that's wajib. So when you say, give a definition of wajib, you'll say the prayer, wudu, fasting Ramadan, this and that, and this, Hajj once in your lifetime, and so on and so on and so on. All of those, if you're defining the reality of what wajib is, you'd have to mention every part of it. So he says here, that's not what the definition is trying to do. لكثرة أصناف الواجبات, because of the large number of types of obligatory acts, واختلاف حقائقها, and the very different natures that these individual obligatory acts have. They're all different from each other. وإنما المقصود, the only purpose of this particular definition we've given here is بيان الوصف, is to clarify a description الذي اشتركت فيه, clarify something that is true of all of these acts. A description that is shared by all of these things that we've mentioned. All obligatory acts share something. It's not the absolute essence of that thing. If I simply say, if I wanted to give the reality of prayer, for example, if I simply said it's something that you are rewarded for doing and punished for not doing, does that tell you the reality of prayer? Do you know what prayer is? By me saying that to you. Is that enough for you to know what prayer is? If I say, you ask me, what's prayer? I say, oh, it's something you're rewarded for doing and punished for not doing. Do you know what prayer is? No, so it's not given the reality of that wajib, but it's given something that is true of that wajib, and that is true of every wajib. So that's what he's trying to do here. That's what he's saying here. حتى صح صدق اسم الواجب عليها. So something that must be true of every wajib act if the use of the term wajib in connection with that act is to be true. وذلك هو ما ذكره من الثواب على الفعل والعقاب على الترك. And that's what he mentions here when he says rewarded for doing and punished for not doing. That is true of every single act under the sun that is wajib. There is no act that is wajib that this is not true of. وكذلك يقال في بقية الأحكام. And the same can be said with respect to all of the other ahkam that we're going to talk about. So he's giving his disclaimer here before somebody comes and says, well, that's not really a definition that's accurate of something that's wajib. It doesn't tell us everything about that wajib thing. فإن قيل, if it is said, قوله يعاقب على تركه يقتضي لزوم العقاب لكل من ترك واجبا. If somebody would object to this, his definition, by saying, okay, well, you say that somebody is punished for not doing this thing, for leaving it. If you say that, then that means that there must be a punishment for every person who leaves any obligatory act. If you're automatically punished for not doing an obligatory act, leaving an obligatory act, then everybody who leaves an obligatory act must be punished. Yeah, that's what the objection is. And he says that's not the case. We know that's not the case because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can remove that punishment from those people who he wants. Some people in the next life, as we mentioned in Aqidah, will have lots of wrong actions, and yet they won't burn for an instant because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give them afu, and other ones will. So If the punishment necessary, and this punishment is referring to the next life punishment, by the way. So he's saying this definition, doesn't that imply that if somebody leaves one of these actions, also there's tawbah, obviously, in this world as well. So if it necessarily implies punishment, how is it then people can sometimes not be punished for not doing? If somebody fails to fast Ramadan for 2 years and then makes tawbah, how is it that he's not going to be punished if it necessarily follows that leaving a wajib entails punishment? That's the objection here. And he says, وَذَلِكَ لَيْسَ بِلَازِمٍ. But that's not necessarily the case. He says, فَالْجَوَابِ, the response, أَنَّهُ يَكْفِي فِي صِدْقِ الْعِقَابِ عَلَى التَّرْكِ, and that it is enough for this statement that somebody is punished for leaving something to be true, وُجُودُهُ لِوَاحِدٍ مِنَ الْعُصَاةِ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala punishes simply one person for it, indicates that there is punishment for that. Because he's punishing them for that action. What else? What other reason would he have? Allah is just. Allah is not going to punish somebody unless they've more merited punishment. And then, so if he punishes one person for that, that indicates that the punishment is for the thing. That's the answer. Alongside his pardoning others. So it indicates that the punishment is for that action, for leaving that obligatory action, but Allah obviously has the capacity on top of that of afu, of pardon, of ghufran, forgiveness. But the act itself is punishable simply if one person is punished for it, because Allah is just and he'll never punish somebody without reason. Is that clear? أو يقال المراد بقوله, or you might say, or it could be said that the meaning of his words وَيُعَاقَبُ عَلَى تَرْكِهِ, that somebody is punished for leaving it, for not doing it. It means تَرَتَّبُ الْعِقَابِ, that iqab follows on from على تَرْكِهِ, from leaving it. كما عبر بذلك غير واحد وذلك لا ينافي العفو عنه. So he says here, when you term it in this particular way, تَرَتَّبُ الْعِقَابُ عَلى تَرْكِهِ, this particular thing of it following on from, which is the way that some other people have expressed this particular definition of an obligatory act. He says this does not contradict Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving afu, this particular way of saying it, because you're not saying it's absolute, you're saying it follows on from it, but then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can then remove that following on. It doesn't necessarily have to happen. It's not connected to the action. It follows on from the action. So it's a separate thing. Because the first one is basically saying that it is a part of the action. Within the action is built-in punishment for not doing it. Whereas this second one is saying that once you do the action and you fail to do the action, then another thing is attached to you as a result. And that thing can be attached or not attached. So it's one is saying it's built in, the other one's saying that it comes as a consequence. وأورد على التعريف المذكور أنه غير مانع, and again it's objected to the ta'rif. It is an objection that's given to this definition that we've mentioned also, that it is غير مانع, it's not exclusive. لدخول كثير من السنن فيه, because many sunnah things also share in this ruling. So basically he's saying this ruling, if you want a ruling to be airtight, then you want it to apply only to that thing and to nothing else. So when we say an action is rewarded for doing it and punished for not doing it, if it applies to other actions apart from wajib actions, then it's not an airtight definition, because something might not be wajib, but this same thing applies to it. That's what he's saying here. So he's saying some people have objected on that basis, saying that there are sunnah actions that this same thing holds true for. So he says here, فَإِنَّ الْأَذَانِ sunnah. So he says the adhan, calling the adhan, is a sunnah. وَإِذَا تَرَكَهُ أَهْلُ بَلَدٍ قُوتِلُوا. But if the entire inhabitants of one of the lands of the Muslims refuses to do the adhan, neglects to do the adhan, he's saying here, they can be fought. This is the person who's giving this objection, because he's going to say that's not actually necessarily the position. that we take. But anyway, وَكَفَى بِذَلِكَ عِقَابًا, and he says, and that is enough punishment that they are fought. That the Muslims are commanded to fight them is enough punishment in itself. That's what he's saying. وَكَذَلِكَ صَلَاةُ الْعِيدَيْنِ, and the same applies to the salat of the Eid prayers, the two Eid prayers, because they both have the same ruling. عِنْدَ مَنْ يَقُولُ بِذَلِكَ, amongst those who say that the same thing applies, that they are fought if you leave the Eid prayers. So if you go to a land and the Eid comes along, and they say, no, we don't do Eid prayer here. No Eid prayer. He's saying that there are a group of Muslims who took the position that that was grounds enough for the Muslims of the other lands to come and fight them, to restore them to doing the Eid prayers properly. And the previous one is that a land decides, okay, we're not doing the adhan. Let's just say we're some random country. Let's call it country X. Says no adhans in our country, the Muslim country. He's saying here in this position that the people took, that's grounds for the people in country Y to come and attack them until they restore the adhan. And that's punishment. وَمَنْ تَرَكَ الْوِتْرَ, and whoever leaves the witr prayer, which is the final rakat at the end of the night after Isha, sunnah mu'akkada amongst us, but I think the Hanafis have it as a wajib action, but wajib sunnah. So not wajib. If somebody leaves that prayer, witr, ruddat shahadatuhu, his testimony is rejected. So this is a position that many of the scholars had, that if a person was known to do the Isha prayer and then call it a night, not ever pray the witr prayer, he was not considered an acceptable witness. So he couldn't be summoned to witness somebody doing a business contract, for example, or to witness somebody doing a marriage. He wasn't accepted. وَنَحْوِ ذَلِكَ, and other similar things. So this is the objection. وَأُجِيبُ, and it is answered, the response to this objection that is laid out here. بِأَنَّ الْمُرَادَ إِقَابُ الْآخِرَةِ, when we say iqab in this definition that we've given, firstly, this is not referring to punishment in this world. Somebody fighting you, maybe a punishing thing, but that's not the punishment of the hereafter. And it's only referring to the punishment of the hereafter. إِقَابُ الْآخِرَةِ. وَبِأَنَّ الْعُقُوبَةَ الْمَذْكُورَةَ لَيْسَ عَلَى نَفْسِ التَّرْكِ بَلْ عَلَى لَازِمِهِ. And the other answer to this is that when he mentions this punishment for the adhan, people coming and fighting them, it is not simply because the adhan is left and not done. It is because of what is connected to that, what that means, what that entails. If they're not doing the adhan, what does that really indicate? What is really connected to that? He says, وَهُوَ الْإِنْحِلَالِ مِنَ الدِّينِ, and it is them slipping away from the deen, or things which are sha'a'ir, are vital things by which the deen is recognized. Casting them aside means that the whole place is slipping away from the deen. So the deen is no longer strong. That's why they're fought. They're not fought simply because of the adhan. They're fought because that's an indication that land is leaving Islam and showing no concern for it. And if they are Muslims in that land and the leadership of that land are allowing the deen to fall away, then that's why they're fought. Not to restore the deen into its place in a land which is part of the lands of Islam. So it's not to do with the adhan itself, it's to do with what that indicates. So he says that's one answer to the objection. وَهُوَ الْإِنْحِلَالُ مِنَ الدِّينِ, and وَهُوَ حَرَامٌ, and that is forbidden. وَرَدُّ الشَّهَادَةِ لَيْسَ عِقَابًا, and as for rejecting somebody's witnessing, making them an invalid witness, that's not punishment, he says. لَيْسَ عِقَابًا وَإِنَّمَا هُوَ عَدَمُ أَهْلِيَّةٍ, it simply means that person does not have the is not valid. He's no longer worthy of being of lirutbatin shar'iyya, of holding a particular level in a legal level, a legal status. He's lost his legal status. He's no longer eligible for a particular legal status that he once had, which is adl, being adl. Because in order to be a shaheed, a witness, you have to be adl. And that means somebody who is reliable and honest, and somebody who's known to practice their deen and not known to do major wrong actions. But again, not known to do the witr is considered to be of a similar status to that. But it's because he's lost that status that his testimony is rejected. It's not a punishment. It's simply somebody has no longer got the criterion for eligibility anymore. شرطها كمالات تجتمع من أفعال وترك. So this particular level of eligibility, the precondition of this is having levels of perfection in terms of certain actions, and in terms of leaving certain actions. So you have to, these things have to be true with you, that you do certain things, and it has to be true for you that you don't do certain things. And if that is the case, then you have this level of eligibility. فَدَخَلَ فِيهَا الْوَاجِبُ وَغَيْرُهُ. And in this, the things that make you adl, some of those things that you are doing, or that you have to do, are wajib. There are sunnah things that you have to do, like this. And there are things that you leave that have to be haram, and maybe there are things that you leave that have to be makruh. You know, that you shouldn't be doing if you're considered an adl. There are certain makruh things that you shouldn't be known to be doing. ألا ترى أن العبد, do you not see that the slave, إذا ردت شهادته, if his testimony is rejected, لم يكن ذلك عقوبة له, it is not a punishment for him, وإنما ذلك لنقصانه عن درجة العدالة, and it is because he falls short of meeting the criteria of being adl. So a slave here, he's talking about somebody who's owned. Their testimony is not accepted because they fall short of meeting the characteristic of being adl, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with the person inherently. If he's owned, for example, then he has to follow the instructions of an owner. So that would make his testimony already be in doubt. But it's not a punishment for the slave. It's simply that his testimony being rejected is because he doesn't meet a criterion. It's not a punishment. على أن الصحيح. And having said all of this, the correct position anyway in the fiqh is that the adhan fil Misr, is that calling the adhan in a major metropolis, in a major land, is fardu kifaya, is an obligation anyway. It's not a sunnah, it's an obligation. There's different types of obligation, by the way. There's fard kifaya, which we've talked about before, and there's fard ayn. Fard ayn is something that every single person who is mukallaf, who is held responsible, has to do. The 5 daily prayers, for example. Fard kifaya is something that is obligatory on the Muslims as a whole, like Salat al-Janazah. If a Muslim dies in Norwich, for example, it is an obligation on us, the people of this place, that at least one of us or some of us do the Salat al-Janazah on that person. Once they've done it, it's not obligatory on anyone else. It's recommended. It's not obligatory. So that's fard kifaya. Some people doing it means it ceases to be obligatory for the rest of us. And he's saying the same thing here is true for the true for the adhan. The same thing here is true for the adhan. The adhan is not a sunnah, he says, when it comes to it being done at least once in a country. It is an obligation on the Muslims. So if you're going to take the position that they're fought, and it's because of the adhan, it's because it's a fard that's being left, not because it's a sunnah. وَنَصَّ أَصْحَابُنَا عَلَىٰ أَنَّهُ لَا يُقَاتَلْ مَنْ تَرَكَ الْعِيدَيْنِ. And as for the 2 Eids not being prayed, he says أَصْحَابُنَا, which means the people of Malik, we in their nusus, in the things that they have written about this, you will find that they say that you are not fought if you leave the Eid. No place is fought for not praying the Eid prayers. وَسُؤَالًا وَارِدَانِ عَلَى حَدِّ الْمَحْظُورِ وَالْجَوَابِ مَا تَقَدَّمَ. These same 2 questions, these same 2 objections that we referred to in this particular passage here, You could also say the same thing about the definition that we're going to give for something which is forbidden. And we're going to come to that in due course. And he says here, and the same two responses can be given. So he's not going to repeat this when we come to the section on forbidden, but just remember that we've already talked about these objections, and this is how we've answered. That's what he says. Ta'rif al-mandub. Wal-mandub, the mandub action, which is the recommended action or the encouraged action. Huwa al-ma'khudhu min al-nadb. This word is taken from nadb. This word nadbun in Arabic. He says, and linguistically, nadb means talab, which means requesting something of somebody, asking for something. Wa shar'an, but as for its legal term, how it is understood in terms of its legal usage, its legal term as a legal term, min haythu wasfuhu bin nadb, when an action is described as having the quality of being recommended, it is ma yuthabu ala fi'lih wa la yu'aqabu ala tarkih. So it is something that you are rewarded for doing, a recommended act or a sunnah act, something that you are rewarded for doing, but not punished for leaving. So, for example, 2 rakats after the dhuhr. If you do them, you get a reward. Alhamdulillah. I mean, we need more reward. But if you leave them, you're not going to have any punishment because you haven't done that. It's mandub. There are certain mandub actions, by the way, that leaving them repeatedly can bring punishment. And those are the ones which are classified as sunnah or sunnah mu'akkada. They are almost at the level of fard. But on the whole, mandub, with the sense of encouraged acts, salat duha, or fasting Mondays and Thursdays, or fasting the day of Arafat, even all of these types of acts, if you don't do them, you're not going to be punished. Ta'rif al-mubah. Wal-mubah, as for permitted acts, min haythu wasfuhu bil ibaha, when it comes to something, an act which is described as being permitted, as having permissibility, it is ma la yuthabu ala fi'lih. It is something that you are not rewarded for doing. There's no reward for doing a mubah act. Yuridu wala ala tarkih. So he says, and you can expand that. You are not rewarded for doing it, and you're not rewarded for leaving it either. There's no reward attached to leaving it or doing it. وَلَا يُعَاقَبُ عَلَى تَرْكِهِ, and you are not punished for leaving it, for not doing it. يُرِيدُ وَلَا عَلَى فِعْلِهِ, and you are not punished for doing it either. So there's no punishment in this action, and there's no reward in this action, whether you do it or you don't do it. أي لا يتعلق بكل من فعله وتركه ثواب ولا عقاب. In other words, there's no thawab, there's no reward, and there's no iqab, there's no punishment that attaches itself to anybody who does it or doesn't do it. So I mean, it's pretty clear. Although some of these acts, if you do them with the intention of them helping you to worship Allah or taking you closer to Allah, they can bring a reward. For example, if you sleep in the day with the intention of having the strength to pray at the night, you're going to be rewarded for that sleep. If you eat your futur, your suhoor, with the intention of having the strength to fast the day, you're going to be rewarded for that suhoor. So I mean, sometimes intentions can change these mubah acts, these permitted acts, to ones that bring reward. But usually, on the whole, these things, when there's no intention involved, there's no reward and no punishment for them. They're just acts that happen. But you'll find that most of the people of Allah who reach high stations with Allah, they basically never do an act without thinking of how it can please Allah. ولا بد من زيادة ما ذكرنا لئلا يدخل فيه المكروه والحرام. So the reason why he added those bits that he added when he said يريد ولا على تركه. So when it's said in the Waraqat, it's an act that you are not rewarded for doing, and he added himself, the sharḥ, nor for leaving. He says the reason why we added what we added is so that this definition doesn't include what is makruh or what is haram, because that first act, something that you are not rewarded for doing, would apply to a disliked act or a haram act, wouldn't it? Because you're not rewarded for doing a haram act. You're not rewarded for doing a sort of disliked act. And the second part, وَلَا يُعَاقَبُ عَلَى تَرْكِهِ, and you are not punished for doing it. If you're not punished for leaving it, that would also apply to a haram act. If you leave an act which is haram, if you deliberately don't drink alcohol, you're not going to be punished for doing that. So he added those extra bits so that it was more comprehensive in terms of the definition. Here he says, تعريف المحظور. والمحظور, he says, and what is forbidden, من حيث وصفه بالحظر, something which is described as having this quality of forbiddenness. He says, and by hadr, it means hurma. So most of us know the words halal and haram. Hurma is something having the status of being haram. He says mahdur is the same thing. Mahdur is haram, forbidden, unlawful. والمحظور ما يثاب على تركه. It's an action that you are rewarded for not doing. He says here, imtithalan. You are rewarded for not doing it if you do it in order to obey Allah. So your reward here for not doing a wrong action is simply because you're doing it in order to obey Allah. If you walk down the street and walk past 100 people and don't steal from every one of them, you're not rewarded simply because you haven't stolen from 100 people as you walk down the street, just because you've avoided something forbidden. It's because, but if you're presented with a chance to steal something, and you resist that temptation and don't do that haram thing, then you are rewarded, because you're doing it because if you make the intention to please Allah, because Allah has commanded you not to steal. But it's not simply the fact that you haven't stolen when, because that would apply to every minute of your day. So imtithalan, it has to be imtithalan. It has to be when you're deliberately doing it out of obedience to Allah with the intention of pleasing Him, basically. وَيُعَاقَبُ عَلَى فِعْلِهِ. So it's something that you are not rewarded for, it's something that you are rewarded for leaving and punished for doing. So you incur a punishment in the hereafter if you do an action that Allah has told you, don't do that. Mahdur. وَتَقَدَّمَ السُّؤَالَانِ وَجَوَابُهُمَا. And the two objections to this definition, we've talked about them before, and we gave the responses to them before. We're not going to do it again. تَعْرِيفُ الْمَكْرُوهِ. And now he says here the definition of makruh, which is usually translated as disliked, discouraged. وَالْمَكْرُوهِ مِنْ حَيْثُ وَصْفُهُ بِالْكَرَاهَةِ. And this action which is called makruh, and that is an action which is described as having the quality of being disliked. It is مَا يُثَابُ عَلَى تَرْكِهِ. Something that you are rewarded for not doing, imtithalan. So again, imtithalan, the same thing. Something which is disliked, you're not automatically rewarded for not doing it. You're only rewarded for not doing that disliked thing if you do it knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has disliked it for you and obeying Him. So if you avoid something which is disliked in the prayer, I mean, that varies from madhab to madhab, but for example, with the Imam Malik disliked us to do the basmala in the Fatiha when we're or the ta'awudh, a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem in the Fatiha, or the basmala. So if we avoid it because we are wanting to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we get reward. If we simply forget about it, we didn't know that, we just simply forgot about those things and started alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen without knowing the ruling, without doing out obedience, simply because we forgot to do bismillahir rahmanir rahim, then you wouldn't be rewarded in that particular context. You understand? So it's only when you do it in order to obey Allah and His Messenger, that you receive a reward for these things. وَلَا يُعَاقَبُ عَلَى فِعْلِهِ. But if you do something disliked, you're not punished for doing it. If you keep on doing them, by the way, though, it can be very dangerous for you, because you're disregarding things that Allah doesn't want for you, and that eventually keeping on the edge means that you'll eventually go over it into doing things that are haram. So it's a very dangerous thing to do. Just like it's very dangerous to leave the things that are recommended for you again and again and again and again, because you start to belittle them. And if you can belittle those smaller commands from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to you, you can start to think little of the bigger ones. So, I mean, it doesn't mean that you're not punished, that it's got no importance. No, it still has importance. But Allah is generous. He's not going to punish us when we do things, when we don't do things that are, or when we do things that are that He's made in that way, because He's a generous and a merciful Lord. وإنما قيدنا ترتب الثواب على الترك في المحظور والمكروه امتثالا. And the reason why we qualified reward for leaving wrong, forbidden actions and for leaving disliked actions, the reason why we qualified it by saying imtithalan, by saying when it's done in obedience with Allah. So he's explaining this himself now. لأن المحرمات والمكروهات يخرج الإنسان من عهدتها بمجرد تركها. Because wrong actions, forbidden actions, and disliked actions, a person goes out of their orbit, in a sense. He's no longer liable for them. This word uhda has the meaning like of daman, very similar. It's like something which you're liable for. He's no longer liable for them simply by him not doing them. This is the general ruling. Anything which is haram, we don't do them. You're not liable for them if you haven't done them. وَإِن لَمْ يَشْعُرْ بِهَا, even if he's completely unaware that he hasn't done them, or he's unaware of these things. Obviously, it's true that you haven't done it, and you're not being punished for it simply by not doing it. فَضْلًا عَنِ الْقَصْدِ إِلَى تَرْكِهَا, to say nothing of the intention to not do them. لكنه لا يترتب الثواب على الترك إلا إذا قصده به الامتثال. But he says, so it's true you're not doing these wrong actions, and you're not going to receive punishment for doing these wrong actions, and that just happens simply by not doing them, regardless of whether you do it with an intention or not. You're not going to get any punishment for a wrong action if you don't do it. Yeah, but getting reward for not doing them, this is a different matter. And he says this only happens when you deliberately make the intention to do it for the sake of Allah, for the reasons I mentioned. فإن قيل وكذلك الواجبات والمندوبات لا يترتب الثواب على فعلها إلا إذا قصد به الامتثال. If somebody were to object and to say, look, what you've said here about forbidden actions and disliked actions, surely the same thing is true for obligatory actions and recommended actions. Surely you would not get a reward for doing those things unless you made the intention of doing it to please Allah. So they're saying, well, why did you add imtithalan for the wrong actions, the forbidden things, but you didn't add imtithalan for the obligatory actions? That's the question here. So he says, فَالْجَوَابِ, the answer, أَنَّ الْأَمْرَ كَذَلِكَ. Yeah, he says, but yeah, the answer is that is true. That the reward for those things is when it is down to intention. ولكنه لما كان كثير من الواجبات لا يتأتى الإتيان بها إلا إذا قصد بها الامتثال. But because the majority of obligatory acts, it's impossible to do those acts without making the intention to do them, because the intention is an integral part of them. This is with the position of Imam Malik. For example, if you don't make the intention to pray, if you don't make the intention to obey Allah when you start your prayer and do what He's commanded of you and fulfill that obligation on you, you're not going to have a prayer. So he's saying it's already inbuilt into the wajibat in most cases that we're doing them for the sake of Allah. That's what he's saying. That's why he didn't mention it for them. is inbuilt. Whereas avoiding wrong actions is not inbuilt in the same way that it automatically is done. As I mentioned with the example of stealing. So he says here, especially in the realm of ibadat, pretty much all of the obligatory acts and the majority of the recommended acts entail an intention already, because you wouldn't be doing them necessarily otherwise. وَهُوَ كُلُّ وَاجِبٍ لَا يَصِحُّ فِعْلُهُ, and this refers to every obligatory action that is not sound to do it, that is invalid to do it, or that is only valid to do it with a niyyah. I mentioned the prayer. There's also wudu. For us, wudu requires an intention. Ghusl, hajj, sawm, tabyit niyyah. Obviously, some things like zakat don't necessarily, well, they do require some level of intention, because you have to go through the process. Simply by going through the process involved in working out your zakat, either the person who's taking it from you has worked that out, in a sense, making the intention for you by taking it from you, or you're making the intention to hand it over. لم يحتاج إلى التقييد بذلك. There's no need of qualifying it in the way that we qualified the wrong actions because of that. وإن كان بعض الواجبات تبرأ الذمة بفعلها, even if some obligatory acts relieve the dhimma is like you pay the debts that you have for, in other words, this thing is on you until you do it, and it's no longer a weight on you because that weight is removed. That's basically like a dhimma. It's often used in debt terms, that you have to remove your dhimma, you'll pay off your debt to somebody. Once that thing is removed, then tabra'u dhimma means that your obligation to do that thing has passed. You've done it, you've fulfilled it. So he says there are some obligatory acts tabra'u dhimmatu bifi'liha, that simply doing that act removes the obligation of that thing from you. وَلَا يَتَرَتَّبُ الثَّوَابُ عَلَى ذَلِكَ, and there is no reward to you for doing that obligatory thing. إِلَّا إِذَا قَصَدَ الْإِمْتِثَالِ, except if you make the intention of doing it for the sake of Allah. So he says here, okay, we didn't add that, but there are some obligatory acts, usually in the realm of mu'amalat, of the transactions between people, that like you pay back somebody's debt. Even if you don't do it for the sake of Allah, you've done something obligatory, but you're not rewarded for it in that case. But the reason he said he didn't add imtithal was because the majority of wajibat that we're talking about here in the deen have niyyah inbuilt into them, or are only done, people are only doing them because they are pleasing Allah. But there are some that don't apply, and you won't get this reward for doing a good action unless you make an intention to do it for the sake of Allah. He said, كَنَفَقَاتِ الزَّوْجَاتِ, like giving wives their maintenance. In other words, their food and the drink and clothing and the housing that's due to them. وَرَدُّ الْمَغْصُوبِ, or when you take something from somebody else without right to taking it, you basically openly steal from them. It's an obligation on you to return what you took. Yeah, you have to do that. That's an obligation. And it's still an obligation on you whether you're doing it for the sake of Allah or not. You still have to do it. وَرَدُّ الدُّيُونِ, returning debts. If you borrowed something from somebody, you have to return them. وَنَحْوِ ذَلِكَ مِمَّا يَصِحُّ بِغَيْرِ نِيَّةٍ, and other such actions which are still sound, are still valid, even if you do them without an intention. You've still met your obligation. If I borrow £100 from you, and I pay you back £100, even if I don't make any intention that I'm doing it for the sake of Allah, I no longer have a debt to you because you've got your £100 back. So the action that I did in returning, this obligatory action that I did in returning the £100, is done. It's valid. It's sahih, but I didn't get a reward for doing it, even though I did an obligatory act. So he says there are those small cases. Wallahu alam, and Allah knows best. So we've got two more we'll do, the sahih and the batil, inshallah. Inshallah, next week we'll go a bit quicker. Ta'rif al-sahih. He says the sahih, this word, by the way, is used in other sciences, like the science of hadith with a different meaning. But here it refers to an action being acceptable to Allah, being sound, meeting the conditions where that action is sound. وَالصَّحِيحُ مِنْ حَيْثُ وَصْفُهُ بِالصِّحَّةِ. So with respect to an action being described as having this quality of sihha, of soundness, istilahan, in terms of its technical meaning here, مَا يَتَعَلَّقُ بِهِ النُّفُوذ. It is what is dependent on it, effectiveness, literally here. Something reach, he says here, he explains it, is this what this word nufud means. He says here, بِالذَّالِ الْمُعْجَمَةِ, and he says this word is nufud with a dhal, mu'jama, that has a dot on it. You think, why does he say that? It's because there's people who he was teaching this to, or the people who will be teaching this text, because al-Hattab was from Morocco, they don't differentiate between the dhal and the dal in terms of the way they speak. So the dhal and the dal sound the same in spoken, so they'll both be dal. And so in order to differentiate them, they call one dal mu'jama. He'd be saying it dal still, even though we know it's dal. Dal mu'jama, which is a dal. Wa dal muhmala, which is a dal without the dot. So that's how that's why you'll see in many of these books that they all differentiate this, because these were verbally taught. And so the students, so in other words, he didn't think that the word was nufud, running out. You had to tell him which type of letter you were using. وَهُوَ الْبُلُوغُ إِلَى الْمَقْصُودِ. So nufud is reaching the target. That's what nufud is. And he explains a couple of lines later. He says here, well, we'll finish this bit and go to it because it's immediately after. He says, كَحَلِّ الْإِنْتِفَاعِ فِي الْبَيْءِ وَالْإِسْتِمْتَاعِ فِي النِّكَاحِ. Such as it becoming permissible, lawful to benefit from something through it being through a sale. So until that thing is sold to you, you can't make use of it. Once it's sold to you, it's now yours to make use of. أو كحل الاستمتاع في النكاح, or deriving sexual pleasure from somebody through nikah. Without marriage, it's not permissible for you. Yeah, so he's saying here that's examples of nufud, of effectiveness, that this thing must be met, this target must be reached before the thing can be sahih, before the thing can be sound or valid. He says here the asl of this word nufud, which is often translated as I said, of effectiveness, having an effect, is min nufud is-sahm, is used for arrows. When they used to fire arrows, that an arrow is considered to have this quality of nufud once it hits its target. So it's the reaching of the arrow to the target that it's aimed at is nufud. أي بلوغه إلى المقصود, it's reaching the target. ويعتد به في الشرع. So he says, and it counts. So it is effective and the action counts. في الشرع, in the law. What does he mean it counts? It means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts it. It counts in the, I mean, in England often you use that term for that when somebody, for example, says to somebody, I divorce you, it counts. We often use that in English. It means that it's had an effect. In other words, it almost seems like it means the same thing. It has an effect, it counts. And he says here that some people say that they both mean the same thing. But here, just before we come to that, he says, وَيُعْتَدُّ بِهِ فِي الشَّرْحِ, it counts in the law بأن يكون قد جمع ما يعتبر فيه شرعا عقدا كان أو عبادة. In other words, that everything that makes this thing considered to have fulfilled its preconditions in the sharh is met. They're all gathered in it. All of the elements that must be in place for this thing to be considered law, to be complete in the law, are in place. That's what sahih is. So it meets all the preconditions. For example, prayer. The preconditions of prayer will be facing the qibla, the person praying being in wudu, the covering your awrah, and not having any physical impurity on you. So that's some of the conditions that have to be met for prayer to be acceptable, for example. So he says aqdan, whether this thing that we're talking about is an aqd, a contract, mu'amala, something between people, or ibadah, or an act of ibadah, an act of worship. فَالنُّفُوذُ مِنْ فِعْلِ الْمُكَلَّفِ. So this part, first part of the definition, nufudh, effectiveness, it refers to the action of the mukallaf. So what the mukallaf has to get right, what has to do for that action to be sahih. وَالْإِعْتِدَادِ, and counting, min fi'l al-shari, it refers to the actions of the lawgiver, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says here, something counting is in the eyes of Allah, something being effective is by you doing what you need to do. But he says here, وَقِيلَ, it is also said, إِنَّهُمَا بِمَعْنًا وَاحِدٍ. Both terms mean exactly the same thing. So they're simply there to explain to you better what he means by effectiveness, is that it counts. تعريف الباطل. And the last of these, the fifth one, is the batil, the opposite of sahih. So something is batil when it's not sahih, invalid, unsound, corrupt. والباطل من حيث وصفه بالبطلان, when something when something has met the quality of being invalid. It is ما لا يتعلق به النفوذ ولا يعتد به, is the opposite. It is what does not have any effectiveness and is not counted. He says here, بأن لم يستجمع ما يعتبر فيه شرعا. It does not contain all of the elements. They are not all gathered within it that would make it accepted in the law. عقدا كان أو عبادة, whether that thing is an act of worship or an aqd, a contract between people. So even with many contracts, you have to have things in place. So sometimes it's witnesses, sometimes it's people being physically present, and sometimes it refers to the words that are used, sometimes it applies to the people making those contracts. But things have to be put in place before that contract can be accepted and count. والعقد في الاصطلاح يوصف بالنفوذ والاعتداد. He says here, with respect to contracts, في الاصطلاح, in technical terms, they can be described as having nufudh, the things that people have to meet, wal-i'tidad, and counting in the eyes of Allah. So they have things that people have to put in place, and then they also have to meet other characteristics once it's done, for it to count in the eyes of Allah. He says, whereas ibadat, acts of worship, tusafu bil-i'tidali faqat, can only ever be described in terms of whether they are acceptable to Allah, whether they count. There's no human element to them. They are done in the way that they have to be done, and they have elements that you have to meet. And once those elements are met, they are acceptable. But with contracts, there are human elements and elements that have to be met in the sight of Allah for a contract to fulfill the conditions of validity. So I think we'll leave it there because we're going to go into a definition of knowledge. Is there any questions about any of that? No? Any questions?
I'll just ask you to send me the book and then
I mean, we didn't go through as much as I want. Next time we'll try and speed up a bit, but it's going through definitions of knowledge next, and what we mean when we talk about, that was what we were talking about earlier, wahm and dhann and all these types of terms. What exactly is ilm? Because obviously there are certain types of ilm that, are absolute, like the ilm of Allah, and then there's ilm of creation, which has different types, different ways that we achieve knowledge of things. But we'll go into that next time. Any questions online? There's a question about the Maliki section of the Wise English College. As far as I'm aware, the way this is working is that we are doing these various books online. They're going to be beginner texts, which theoretically there will be 4. So we've done, this is the 3rd one. The 4th one is in the realm of tasawwuf. And then potentially, depending on how things are working out, we'll move to medium level texts, and then eventually to higher level texts. That's the idea. So we start with each of the elements, fiqh, and then we started with Ibn Ashir, and the next time we might go to the Risala, for example. And then we started with Jawharat al-Tawheed, and then you can go to another book which has a bit more, like the Sanusiya or something else of that nature. And then with usul, we started with the Waraqat, but then there's many other sort of medium level books such as Miftah al-Usul and Maraqi' al-Su'ud and other things that we could potentially go to. But it's to give people a taste anyway of these books. That's what we're aiming for with this. Anyway, we'll finish there inshallah unless there's any other questions online. Okay, bismillah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد عبدك ورسولك النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين السلام عليكم